Don Carlo, libretto by Joseph Méry and Camille Dulocle. First performance on the 11th of March 1867 at the Académie Impériale de Musique, Paris. Émile Perrin, director of the Opéra in Paris, was determined to have a new opera by Giuseppe Verdi for the Parisian theatre. Through Léon Escudier, with whom Verdi was in contact for the revision of Macbeth, he constantly suggested new subjects. In June 1865, Verdi replied to him, "Are you joking? Write for the opéra with that trifling matter of priorities arranged by Madame Meyerbeer, who flaunts brooches, snuff-boxes, medallions, batons, etc. What a business! Even art has turned banker, and one has to be a millionaire. Otherwise, there's no chance of success." France, 1560. Elisabetta di Valois, daughter of the King of France, crosses through the forest of Fontainebleau, throwing bread to the woodcutters. Don Carlo, Infante of Spain, has come in secret to Fontainebleau in order to see his betrothed, Elisabetta di Valois. Elisabetta and Carlo meet and fall in love with each other, but the idyllic situation does not last for long. Tebaldo the page reaches them with the news that the King of France wishes Elisabetta to be married to Filippo II, King of Spain, and not his son, Don Carlo. Elisabetta resigns herself and accepts her father's will. Carlo despairs. In the cloisters of the convent of Saint-Just, in front of his grandfather's tomb, the Emperor Carlo V, Don Carlo searches for comfort. Carlo hears the voice of a monk. To him, it sounds like the voice of his grandfather. Rodrigo, the Marquis of Posa, arrives and urges Don Carlo to become a champion of liberty for Flanders, the land oppressed by the King of Spain. If he does so, Carlo will be able to overcome his personal unhappiness and learn to become king. Rodrigo and Carlo vow eternal friendship to one another. In a garden by the gates of Saint-Just, Princess Eboli is in the company of her ladies-in-waiting and pages. With them is Elisabetta. Rodrigo arrives with a letter for Elisabetta. Don Carlo wants to see her. Elisabetta and Don Carlo meet. Don Carlo asks her to intercede with the King of Spain for the people of Flanders, and then he gives in and renews his declarations of love. When Filippo II, the King of Spain, arrives, Rodrigo pleads with him to have mercy on the oppressed people of Flanders. Filippo does not intend to relax the severity with which he rules the Flemish people. Even though he admires Rodrigo's passion, Filippo asks Rodrigo to keep an eye on Don Carlo and warns him to beware of the Grand Inquisitor. Eboli has sent Don Carlo an anonymous invitation to meet at night time in the royal gardens. Don Carlo arrives and he comes across Eboli, who is in disguise. Believing that she is in fact Elisabetta, Don Carlo speaks to her in lover's tones. But when Eboli discovers that she has been mistaken for Elisabetta, she vows to take revenge. During the ceremony of auto da fe, Filippo sends the heretics to the stake. Don Carlo pleads the cause of the Flemish, but Filippo will not be moved. Don Carlo draws his sword against his father. Filippo orders the disarming of Carlo. Rodrigo intervenes and convinces Carlo to lay down his sword. Filippo, alone in his room at the Escorial, reflects upon his unrequited love for Elisabetta and his lonely fate. Filippo intends to get Carlo out of the way and asks the Grand Inquisitor's advice. The Grand Inquisitor is willing to absolve the king. However, he demands that Rodrigo is brought to justice. Filippo, who has come by Elisabetta's jewel box that contains a picture of Don Carlo, accuses his wife of infidelity. Elisabetta, overcome with shock, faints. Eboli confesses to Elisabetta that it was she who gave the jewel box to Filippo out of jealousy. Rodrigo reaches Carlo in prison and, before he is killed by the king's henchmen, begs Carlo to persevere in his support of the cause of the people of Flanders. Filippo offers his son freedom, but Carlo expresses his disgust that his father has murdered Rodrigo. At this moment, the people, led by Eboli, burst in and demand that Carlo is handed over to them, but the Grand Inquisitor puts an end to the rebellion. Carlo manages to escape thanks to the help of Eboli. In the convent of Saint-Just, Elisabetta is waiting for Don Carlo to bid him a final farewell before he leaves for Flanders. Filippo comes across the couple, and the Grand Inquisitor orders Carlo's arrest. From the cloister gates, a monk's voice can be heard. It is Carlo V, who takes Carlo with him into the cloisters. Don Carlos, staged at the Paris Opera in 1867, is the third and final opera that Verdi wrote for the French public. The Grand Opera, that was the prevailing fashion in France at that time, called for an extremely articulate dramatic structure from the composer that would have important scenery and the intervention of danced pieces. For the 1884 performance at La Scala Theatre, Verdi carried out a substantial reworking of the score, omitting the first act and the ballets. In 1886, he went back on this decision, and for the theatre in Modena, he reintegrated the first act that he had taken out. And by doing so, he reconstructed the original musical structure of the opera. The constant adaptations of Don Carlo possibly reflected on the fact that this opera was not one of the most successful within Verdi's repertoire. However, the fact remains that Don Carlo represents the absolute peak of Verdi's art. His exploration of the psyche of the characters had never before reached such intensity, and the music takes on striking dramatic depth. What Verdi highlights most are the dark wanderings of the human soul that is coming to grips with power, a theme that had fascinated him since Macbeth. And, from this point of view, in particular, the fourth act is unbeatable, with the grand scene of Filippo's solitude and the duet between the king and the Grand Inquisitor, the sinister and profoundly illuminating encounter between the will of the state and that of religion. In the classification of Verdi's most performed operas in the world, Don Carlo comes in 10th place. In the classification of the most performed operas in the world, Don Carlo comes in 41st place.